It is 8:36 a.m. on February the 9th, 2020, and I am sitting here in the neutral ground on Palafox Street, just north of Gregory. If you look down on the other side of the street, you go straight to King Plaza, where I tried to give my announcement for Congress on Tuesday, but our worthless reporters, none of them showed up. I'm talking now because I want to talk about public beaches and why they are so important to the development of Florida. You have to remember that this state, Florida attained statehood in 1845, and Florida was brought into the United States generally after the War of 1812, well after that, because actually in the War of 1812, West Florida was simply split off from the current state of Florida, and actually and it was divided into thirds. A third went to the state of Louisiana, a third went to Mississippi Territory, and Louisiana they're known as the Florida parishes. In Mississippi Territory, that third was then divided between Mississippi and Alabama, and I think it's by something like the 89th meridian, because I know Mobile's in an 88, so it's something like the 89th meridian divided Alabama from Mississippi. And then, of course, the other third was subsumed into current Florida. And so, but remember, in the early days of Florida, you had a little plantation belt there in the Big Bend by Tallahassee. You had the city of Pensacola never really met the wild expectations, and actually the military has driven the economy from the beginning here in Escambia County. Escambia County was much larger in the early plats of the state of Florida, and the counties formed over time. Walton County, the Walton County that existed in 1861, notably voted against secession. Of course, that Walton County was a different configuration than the Walton County of today, contained a lot of modern-day Okaloosa County. Okaloosa County was generally taken from parts of what had been Santa Rosa County and then Walton County to create a personal political fiefdom for a man named Maypoles, and Maypoles would represent the county in the legislature and hold a number of offices there. Maypoles ended up, the reason why Bob Sikes rose to power is that he first came to Valparaiso and then went to, he first lived in Valparaiso and then he went to Crestview, and he was editing a local paper, and simply by virtue of it being the other paper in town, and the paper that was the other paper in town from the Sikes paper being the paper that was the paper of the Maypoles faction, Sikes ended up unwittingly becoming the main politician that the anti-Maypoles faction backed. Sikes won his first election to the Florida House in 1936, won another term in 38, and ran for the open seat of the departing Congressman Millard Caldwell, who had a lot of ties to Santa Rosa County. Millard Caldwell would serve as governor of Florida from 1945 to 1949. But that's generally how Sikes rose in Okaloosa County as part of the anti-Maypoles faction. And I've digressed a bit here, but I'm talking about beach development. The reason why, though, is that Florida, though, you have generally, I would say even south down to, you have a few poles of development. Tampa was completely different than the rest of the state. You can't even really call it like a northeastern city, but Tampa was defined in early days by cigar manufacturing. And 1920s Tampa is portrayed very well in the film by Ben Affleck known as Live by Night, which is one of my favorite films. It focuses entirely on Tampa in the 1920s. But Tampa actually remains a southern, a lot of people who have this different idea of the South as redneck think that Tampa does not remain a southern city. Tampa very much remains a southern city in its guts. But Tampa was defined by the Italian community, the Cuban community, other Spaniards are basically what is known as Tampa Latins, and then Tampa Italians are considered part of the Tampa Latin community historically. And then the cigar industry. But Tampa, for a time, was the largest city in Florida. Remember, Tampa was the first true big major city in Florida. In the 1920s, it was the largest city in the state. Miami's heyday came later Technically, Jacksonville Duval is the largest municipality in Florida, though Miami is the largest metro area. But remember, in the 1880s, they were actually discussing draining the Everglades when Governor Perry was in office. But after the war, remember, you only had a small plantation belt. Florida was very much, it was basically, south of, once you got south of, Stark, you really didn't have a lot of plantations down there. Florida was basically Appalachia and the swamps culturally, and in terms of who farmed there. You didn't have a lot of big plantations to begin with. Farming did move over time. You had citrus farmers, but you really didn't have, say, the kind of outright sharecropping that you did in much of the South. We all know the stories of the migrant farmers who died in the hurricane of 1928 around Palm Beach County and other parts of Lake Okeechobee. Notice it's migrants, migrant farm workers. The idea of the near serfdom of sharecroppers tied to the land, it really wasn't as prevalent on the peninsula as it was in other parts of the South. And to an extent, and generally south of Polk County, you really didn't see the full development, both agriculturally and all else, until after Governor Broward drained the Everglades. And understand, Governor Broward if someone was going to do it, the main opponent to that was Henry Flagler, but someone was going to drain the Everglades. So if it hadn't been Broward, it would have been someone else. And people are nitpicking Broward now, but in terms of characters in Florida history, he is one of the most benign. He's also something of a true cowboy in a Florida sense, because here's someone who came to his career as a ship captain. He was captain of the Three Friends, and he started as a deckhand. He ran guns to the Cuban revolutionaries in the 1890s. He's still well remembered in Cuba for this by everyone, because he won the island of freedom from Spain, and everyone agrees that was a good thing. And Broward was hunted by his own government. He became sort of a legend in the state. But you have to remember, you have these but the most important thing in the development of Florida was Henry Flagler coming down south with his fortune. At first he goes to St. Augustine. He builds a hotel there. He then progressively moves south. And then he finally, he dies I think sometime right as Woodrow Wilson sworn into office. But here in Florida, Flagler is responsible for building the Florida East Coast Railway, but Tampa developed on a totally different tack. But if you look at congressional district maps of Florida, there were several decades when Florida picked up a second congressional seat. What they literally did is they drew a line down the peninsula, and the entire western half of the state, which would include the Panhandle and then the West Gulf Coast, down to Monroe County would be one district, and the eastern half of the state would be another. They have drawn interesting districts in Florida over the years, congressional. And remember, Florida's population was much smaller than it had been. You had a few. Tampa was really the big center of population. Miami became the second big center of population, and that development started beginning in the 1910s. Miami boomed in the 1920s. You saw the development of Boca Raton by Addison Misner in the 1920s. You saw Palm Beach County coming to its stride, but of course Henry Flagler began developing Palm Beach in the 1890s. Palm Beach County saw some of the earlier development, and then all of that had once been Dade County and was broken up over the years. To the extent, I think that they are going to do, there was another recording that I mentioned something, disregard that. I was generally where I'm at, they deliver breakfasts on Sundays right around a few minutes from now, and I see crowd lining up, so they might do it this morning. But I want to get back on to my subject here, and that is, and I had referenced that in a recording that I had meant for someone else, but I ended up deciding to trash. But as I look at the Governor Perry mansion, I want to focus on the fact that your next big polar development became Miami. And actually, for a while, it was a competition between Jacksonville and Tampa, of which was the biggest city. But Tampa, other than cigars, never really developed a kind of manufacturing sector that was associated with Jacksonville. Jacksonville was the one true city of heavy industry in Florida. Heavy industry would come to Pensacola during the war, and afterwards but it was really Jacksonville was the center of true heavy industry in Florida, the one true industrial style city in the state of Florida. And it was who would be the largest in the state. Now, and where does this get to beach development? It's very simple. What is it that brings everyone to Florida? What is it that brought Henry Flagler to Florida and moved him progressively south? Brought plants, brought the Collier, that Collier County is named after, I believe, Baron Collier, brought so many people, and it's always the beaches. Palm Beach was always private. But even on the island that Palm Beach is on, there's a public beach on the physical island at Lantana. And it is always the beaches that brought people to Florida. It was all these beaches that were untamed. It was one of the first things Bob Sikes remarks that he noticed when he came down to this part of the state were the beaches. It's what everyone noticed. Edward Ball, Alfred DuPont. And the reason is, in the United States, look at where the beaches are. You've got the Atlantic, you've got Hawaii, you've then got the West Coast. So California has a bit of a different climate than the Gulf Coast. California is besought with earthquakes. In terms of where the beaches are and the climate, the other thing is that California, has the big breakers. You don't have that on the Gulf. You have a different ocean sphere. The seas down here are calmer. That's why all the surfers are in Los Angeles and not so much here. But, in terms of warm weather beachfront, it's a precious resource in the United States because you've basically got Florida, coastal Alabama and coastal Mississippi, and a lot of the beaches in Mississippi are man-made. They are, of course, do have a 3-month winter. Though the 3-month winter on the Gulf Coast is climatologically similar to about 4 or 5 months, close to 6 months of the year at beaches in the Northeast. That's why the snowbirds are fine coming down here. Because to them, half of the year, that's what beach weather is, what we get in winter. But you basically have warm weather beaches. You have California, you have some of Texas, you have a little bit of coastal Alabama, you have the state of Florida. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, for example, is your next real big touristy beach up the Atlantic coast. It's got condos and everything. Myrtle Beach, of course, has a slightly colder climate overall, cold. And the further north you go, the colder it is, the less active beach city. And so Florida occupies a unique position within the American economy for beaches. And this matters because it is the beaches that bring everyone to this state. When World War II came, they built all these military reservations, and that was the next big boom of growth because everybody who came down here got used to hanging out at the beach. They all stayed in Florida. It was one of the most important economic development periods in the state of Florida. All that growth in the 40s and 50s were from people who had come here in the service and stayed. So, the trend towards privatization of beaches is rather worrisome. Because understand right now, if you're looking, and I'm going to go further into depth in this. I'm going to talk specifically about the density corridor that covers much of coastal Escambia County and goes across several states. I'm going to talk about some other things, but in Florida, our beaches are what attracts economic development here. It's why everyone comes here. It's why you come to Florida. It's part of our ethos. It's part of just the brand name of the state. And so the trend towards beach privatization is worrisome because, for example, you look at Pensacola Beach. Pensacola Beach, you have a public beach, and there you have a public beach in Pensacola Beach, and then you have all the private homes go up back to it, but it's all public beach. And then on the other side, on the canal, you've got some people with docks, and then there are marinas on the island. But that's generally actually how much of Florida has developed throughout time. This state has been known for its public beaches. And that's why this is such a controversial issue. And one thing from my party is, if we become identified as the party of beach privatization, we have just lost the state politically, because that is why people come to Florida. But also in terms of economic developments, we are screwing ourselves, because we are now a state of 22 million people, but we have the job profile maybe of a state of 10 million. And that's because of the large number of retirees in our state. But the thing is, I would focus on how Miami developed, because the Miami model was that they came in the 1910s and 20s. It was sold as a boom area. They built the hotels, but the thing is, when you think of the kind of economy that Miami has today, they did not have that in 1930. It basically became a tourist trap town for a decade. And when the gambling vote failed in the 30s, all that investment went to Nevada for a while. But gambling continued underground in Miami, just not financed by big business. And when World War II came, it was important because after the war, all the veterans started settling in the Miami area, and you saw this just boom in financial services and whatnot. And there were some little factory-type enterprises in Miami, the kind of industry that any American city had at the time. But Miami was never an industrial hub, not on the level of Jacksonville. But you saw all these businesses come to Miami, and it became a self-reinforcing phenomenon. The condos brought the people to the state. And understand, one of the biggest issues we face in Florida is that you now have developments like the Villages being built in the heart of rural Florida. You have the loss of more and more of our beautiful countryside. And this is an issue. And when you think of the cracker vote in this state, there is no one who hates to see the natural landscapes of our state more than the crackers. And this issue has been raised for a time. And remember, when Bob Graham was governor, we did not even have 10 million people. We now have 22 million. And so we have seen close to a tripling of population since Governor Graham's first term. And we're not adding any more land. And so I think that we need to really begin to adopt a smart growth and a pluralist agenda in the state. The idea, if a city in the interior naturally grows, that's great. But the idea of just developing subdivisions for retirees around Ocala and Sumter County and all that, I find that troublesome, because what we're doing is we're creating a bunch of suburban developments that are chopping up land that was once rural. So we're losing more of our agricultural footprint of the state. We're losing more of the historic southern and cracker part of the state. And at the meantime, understand that these are the type of developments that predominated in California. And California has become what it has become. And the last thing we want to do is Californiaize this state in terms of where it basically becomes a sort of communist adjunct kind of state. And so I would like to see a focus on density and new urbanism and urbanization in our state. And in particular, I would say that think of the Miami model, and then think about how along so many beaches in Florida, the state with the most high-rises in the United States in terms of high-rise concentrations and how many concentrations that you have and how many different corridors is actually the state of Florida. They are all beachfront condos. There are condo towers all across the state. What you see in the corridor from Gulf Shores to Perdido Key now is something that has been done in all parts of Florida. So, but the beaches, the thing is, in a beach town, if you have public beaches, now it's one thing to have marinas, and I would say that we should make marinas an accommodation in this state. There should be enough boat slips in the state of Florida so that everyone who wants a boat can store a boat in this state. But I would say that in Florida, we have to begin really working on this. Some folks are walking down the street, and I didn't want to have my recording interrupted. But it's been almost 20 minutes now. But we have to come up with a strategy here in Florida to develop the land. I lost my train of thought. We have to, the beach is our key natural resource. It is the key natural resource of this state. So what do we do with the beach? What do we do with the beach in Florida? I would say that generally, in some areas there's going to be private ownership, but I would like to say Florida beaches remain publicly owned, because I believe that the beaches, if you live in a town in Florida, but you know that anywhere in town you can use that public beach, you're going to use that public beach. You know, what this is going to do is this is going to draw people to our state, and it's an advantage that we have that proportionally we've got far more public beach in terms of where our population is located and in terms of beachfront than the state of California does or any other state in the country does. It is our greatest economic asset. And so one of the first bills I'm going to introduce in Congress, consider that Bob Sikes is most famous for the Sikes Act, which was a conservation measure, which is still in force and it comes up every few years for more money and whatever. I'm going to do what I think Bob Sikes might do in this situation, and I'm going to propose a law. And basically, the law would be is that if you're familiar with Fairhope, Alabama, you'll know that it was founded on the single tax colony principles of Henry George, and Henry George was close to being a socialist. Fairhope actually has a lot of political radicalism in its history from the time that George settled the town. But on a lot of lots in Fairhope, these legacy lots, you don't actually own the property. What you do is you sign a 99-year lease, kind of like the British had on Hong Kong. My proposal is that we would basically, now this would be an interesting kind of lease the state of Florida would do. The state of Florida will take all public beach land and it will lease it to the federal government. But the terms of lease will be that Florida continues to administer it. The sole purpose of creating the lease, and this would be a 99-year lease, is that the United States government will pay the state of Florida so much money for the lease. The United States government will pay the state of Florida so much money to lease the public beaches. And I'm thinking in terms of an annual expenditure. And I would work with the administration in Tallahassee and the Florida cabinet and the legislature to come up with an amount. But basically, this would be a lease in terms annually, and then we would say that it would be adjusted per inflation as necessary. But basically, this would be money into the treasury of Florida every year. Much more money than is needed actually to upkeep the beaches. And to be clear, some of that money will be earmarked for that, and the beaches will continue to be administered by the state of Florida. But the main purpose of the federal government signing this lease is to protect the beaches from private development. Because what we're talking about right now with the issue of beach privatization is beaches that are public being sectioned off of private development and sold. And understand, if we do that, we have the potential to be the economic powerhouse of the world as a state in the next century. We will completely kill that off if we allow all the beaches to become privatized. Because you take, for example, Orange Beach, where there are only a few public beach areas. The rest of it's owned by the condos. A completely different atmosphere from Pensacola Beach, and this has become a major issue in the Destin area too. And this became an issue in Pensacola with the Save Our Beach movement. This is what will kill the golden egg, the goose that laid the golden egg in the state of Florida, if we allow our beaches to privatize. We cannot allow our beaches to privatize, and as your next congressman, I will not permit any more of our beaches to privatize in the state. I view the beaches as a public resource, and I also view it as the economic necessity to allow Florida to reach its greatest growth potential along the lines that 21st century growth will need to reach upon in this century in order to maximize economic growth, well-being for everyone, while being the most ecologically sound. And so beach privatization has to be nipped in the bud in the state, and I intend to do my part. And basically, for example, it would be something like literally, right now, the lease would be something akin to perhaps double our state budget. And then the state of Florida, we would use that money to invest in any number of worthy projects. One thing I can think of is lowering the insurance premiums that homeowners have to pay in the state, because the national insurance markets have decided to rate Florida on insurance rates to subsidize lower than market rates for persons who pay policies in New York, Iowa, California, and so forth. But the key thing is that I think you can get Congress to pay for this, because Florida beaches, they are our beaches, but understand our state, in particular our state, if you look at the Florida state budget, you will see that a large chunk of the Florida state budget comes from sales taxes. But sales taxes, but remember, in Florida, lodging taxes on that little line of the budget, they're considered part of sales taxes. A good portion of our state government runs on lodging taxes, paid for people who come from outside the state to use our beaches. And the fact is, if you take all the public beaches in Florida and you drive them up and make them private, we will see our lodging taxes collection nosedive. And that will hurt education, that will hurt economic development, that will hurt the future of the state. This is the most severe issue facing the state of Florida at this time. And I realize I may have had a long and winding intro, but maybe I'm making my point very saliently and cogently now. We cannot allow our beaches to go public in this state. It will ruin the future of Florida. It will hurt our sunshine children, I assure you. And so that's why I want to propose this program. And the reason why I think we can get Congress to sign it, and I think we can get a president to sign it, is remember, Governor Jeb Bush got the state taken off the limits from offshore oil drilling by President George W. Bush. Now, of course, they're brothers. He could do that. But Florida has always been seen as different because our beaches are our natural resource. They are our natural resource, but they're not just for us. You know, where does most of America go when they go to the beach? You know, some people on the West Coast go out to beaches in California, but most people in the Midwest, most people in the Northeast, when they come down south to the beach, they come south to Florida. Districts controlled by both parties. The votes exist in Congress, especially with the fact that Floridians of either party are always going to sit on the Appropriations Committee and at least the House, and usually in the Senate whenever we desire. The votes now exist that we can get, even if we're basically being awarded $200 billion a year, the votes exist to vote us the appropriation, because the most of America does see, they are, I believe in states' rights. They are our beach. We should remain control of them. And that's why I'm suggesting that the federal government lease the beaches out from us to preserve it, rather than the federal government buy it and turn it into federal land where we have no control, where we have no authority. But you can get this passed because to most of the nation, when most of America goes to the beach down south, they're going to a beach in Florida. And they are a national resource, and they're vital to our state's economy. And so I realize it's been a roundabout way to do this, but I had to do an intro on some of the economic history of Florida. But one of my first acts in Congress is going to be to propose a legislation modeled on the Sikes Act, which would basically be the lease out of all public beach land in Florida by the federal government. And what the federal government's really paying for, because it's not going to take control of anything, what the federal government's basically doing is paying the government of the state of Florida to not privatize the beaches. And something tells me that by putting it in for 99 years, this will become institutionalized, and so we'll adjust with inflation, but this will be a dividend, the preservation of Florida beaches that could be then spent by the government of the state of Florida, that will be able to be passed on to generations and generations of Florida children. And the other thing is that this might be used as a carrot to entice other areas adjoining the state of Florida into annexing into our state, sort of how right now there is an open question of whether the sanctuary counties in the state of Virginia on gun rights are going to remain under the authority of Richmond or are going to go under the authority of Charleston. As a lot of people know, that the capital of West Virginia is called Charleston. There are actually two significant cities in the United States named Charleston, the other being Charleston, South Carolina. But this is what I wanted to convey this morning, and it is now 9:05 a.m., and I have recorded for 28 minutes. But this is but I want to begin introducing this. I guess we'll call this a talk rather than a full position paper. And that's the one thing, when you're talking, you talk as you talk conversationally rather than with the polish that you might put in a position paper when you're formally organizing it. But again, I view beach privatization as one of the greatest evils facing our state. And one thing I can assure you, you elect Andy Romagnano to Congress, I'm going to put the kibosh on all beach privatization in this state, I assure you. Have a blessed day. Oh, that's how you end the phone. All right, I got to press the stop button.